But hello, everyone. Welcome to Unreal Fest at the Gold Coast at day one. I hope you are enjoying as much as I am. My name is Adrienne Pugh. I'm a technical UI design director at Epic. I don't know what that means, but we'll figure that out together. I do happen to do a lot of UI, and so I want to showcase some of the amazing things in UMG that you should be trying. Now, this talk is going to go very fast. We have 20 things to cover in Engine Live demos for each one. It's going to go rapid. Feel free to take out your phones, take a lot of photos, get some video. The content will go out live, but not sure when afterwards. But let's get into it. So we're going to cover animations, absolute, additive blends, material blending, the play forward and reverse nodes, if you aren't aware of those. We're going to cover some useful widgets, stack boxes, common lazy image, common visual attachment, common text box, you can see a theme, wrap boxes, and spacers. We're also going to cover the DPI font setting, brand new, very exciting, modifying the ascend and descend values of fonts, applying a line height to the bottom of your font or removing it, and mono-spaced. We're also going to even go to more performance tips. So we're talking about invalidation, less is more, Slate prepass widgets, pixel snapping, anti-aliasing, and editor utility widgets. And of course, the brand new feature in 5.4, the experimental Slate post buffer, we will cover that as well. So what is this demo and its use cases? This demo was built on the UI Material Lab. Here's the QR code to grab it. If you haven't seen it already, it was created by one of our lovely tech designers that has a lot of materials referenced here. We also showcase common UI widgets. Basically, Fortnite is built on common UI, so it's interchangeable into how we work. And this is a unique talk where we're going to talk about weird solutions to problems that you might not have encountered yet. So we don't necessarily use these on the daily, but these are things that are like ace in your hole. You can use these when you need them to solve those unique challenges. And let's get straight into it. So we're going to cover animations first. The very first one that I want to go over is kind of this hidden gem of Sequencer, is the absolute, additive, and additive to base sections. These sections basically allow you to tween values without ever having to touch blueprints. Additive and absolute tracks also introduce a new way to keyframe things differently. So you can actually blend these sections together rather than needing to keyframe every single value. And you can actually create your own animation style guide using your own curves. So what do I mean by that? Let's actually go into Engine now. I've set up a bunch of examples here. So we're going to go into our very first one. And we're going to run our little animate object. This is something very basic, animating the object in. However, let's actually take a look at what is set up here. So if we go into our widget, we have our lovely position transform. I muted the first track so we can kind of see what's going on here. But in the animations, we just have this animation transform that's translating the current value. So you can see the current value in this area up here. It's going to animate from the current value to whatever I set in this track. And how is it animating it? It's animating it by this tiny little curve out here. And guess what? You can actually modify all of these curves to be any kind of standard curve that you've seen around. So we could swap it, play it, and it's now going to be a different curve. Now again, I have this muted. You don't even need this track here, but this is to indicate how it will know whatever your relative position is. Before you started the animation, it will actually know that content. So we can go in here, translate this all the way across and up. And when I go into try to play the animation, guess what? It's going to animate from that new relative position. I didn't have to re-keyframe anything, and it will actually animate it to wherever it's going. And you can use your own curves in here. So these are the pre-built curves. But if you wanted to have your own curve style guide, say your UI artists have designed a bunch of curve style guides, you can actually use your own curves for that use case. The other instance we're going to talk about is the additive. This is I don't know if you have a similar concept in Australia, but we have a concept of an inchworm in the States. I don't know if we call this a centimeter worm. But we are just adding 50 pixels to wherever its current position is. So you can actually use these blend sequences to also animate additive values. So if we go into this blueprint here, we can take a look at our animation. And it's very simple. It's a blend type of being to additive. And we're just adding 50 pixels to wherever its current value is. And you can also break the editor by doing this, which is my favorite thing to do. So that's some introduction into additive and absolute for that. So let's flip on to the next topic. Guess what? Anything that you can do with those transforms, you can also do in material properties. So material properties in the sequencer have exactly the same blend sections. They support absolute, additive, additive from base. You can, again, have all the curve styling that you want and do a bunch of that stuff. So let's showcase a quick little demonstration. We've got our widget here is actually just this potion material. Again, this is using the UI Material Lab. We have a lot of fun material properties here, potions, bubbles, etc. So all I'm doing in the animation is I'm going to fill it by 10%. And this is an additive section, so it's just going to add 10% each time. And let's actually take a look at that in our editor utility widget. We're going to run this. And voila, we've got an easy fill. I don't even need to animate anything special. It's already set in. I don't have to have blueprint logic. This is just sequencer in its core form. So highly recommend that. Now let's get into the next topic, which is the play forward and reverse node. I was kind of shocked when I started at Epic. Some people don't know about this node. This is a very useful node for when you're playing an animation forward or in reverse. It will remember where the user left off and gracefully revert the animation from that state. Super handy for what you're going with. Now let's open up that widget. Got a nice little reticle demo that is probably excessive and should never be in gameplay, but you know, this is my dream. So we have this crazy reticle here that when I hover it, it's going to change a bunch of these fun states, and if I unhover, you can see the play track at the bottom is basically my sequencer timeline, and it's going to gracefully revert back from exactly where I started hovering or unhovering the animation. Now you can do this with the play forward node, but I'm going to do a little demo. We're going to set our switcher to 1. This is just using the regular play animation node. And you can see when I unhover, it's going to play from the end of the animation each time. So if you are using the same animation to play forward, I would say play forward and reverse node makes it super easy, seamless interactivity. Highly recommend using that instead of the play forward node. Next up, we're going to have our new topic of useful widgets, common UI or otherwise. The very first one is a cool new widget, the stack box. This basically combines a vertical box or a horizontal box, and you can control the orientation in animations or inside of blueprints. This is a funky new little box, and I want to show it off. So we've got a very basic example, but when you're often designing something, you're like, oh, I'm going to put it in the horizontal box, and then you're like, wait a minute, the design has changed. I need to wrap with a vertical box. We now have one fancy little stack box that you can change it either at design time or at runtime to set to vertical. So kind of easy for your designs if you're changing them a lot, or think about mobile, right? What if this is landscape, a huge widescreen monitor, and then as it gets to mobile, you want the contents to shift to be a vertical alignment? Stackbox can do that for you. Next up, we've got common lazy image. So common lazy images are great for soft references. If you need to load in a loading spinner as you're loading in something, it allows for custom loading visuals, and it includes this very useful material texture parameter so that you can actually have a master material and soft reference the textures that you're loading in. Very useful, and in fact in Fortnite we use this for our item shop and the discovery menu. This is pretty much a critical feature for us. Now I tried to get this to show any kind of loading visual, but these computers are too fast. It will not show any loading. So instead, I'm going to kind of show you this is what it would look like for my own spinner. I just kind of made this for fun, a little hexagon STF spinner. But what's awesome about this is, again, this advanced texture parameter name. So I can have a master material that I pipe in my interactivity, my mouse hover, and all of that, and all I have to do is soft reference the actual texture inside, and that will then load. So this is that set material by texture name, and then you can get your various soft references into a master material. And again, we use this all the time on Fortnite. We don't need to recreate the same material 8 million times to have interactivity. We just pipe in the different texture icon into this method. And let's get on to our next common visual attachment. This one's a great widget for anchoring things when you don't want it to take up layout space. This is fantastic for controller prompts, alert notifications, mark as red dots, anything that needs to be on top of a widget or next to it, but not actually take up layout space. Now, what do I mean by layout space? We will see very shortly. So this is my favorite widget. Anyone who hates those red dots? Nope, done. Missed calls, don't care. Responsibilities out of the way. Chores, updates, messages, inbox. Oh, we're clear. We're all good now. So that was a fantastic use case of that common visual attachment. Now I'm going to switch it to another implementation where I don't use that, and we'll see what that particularly looks like. In this case, if I hit the dishes, it now pops up the layout. Because Unreal is this is actually taking up layout space, so as soon as it's missing, it will then collapse in. So this is a way that you can kind of avoid that. Now let's also take a look at the other example, which is controller prompts. This is pretty common, is that when a user plugs in the controller, your text or your button shifts around to make space for that controller prompt. If you use a common visual attachment, it actually won't do that. So let's get into the actual widget itself. Here's the common visual attachment here. It's being set at a 0.5 anchoring. Now we can take a look at the overlay, and you can see Unreal thinks that this widget only takes about this much space. It's not even calculating this into the layout, so it's ignoring it for taking up space. And what's awesome about the common visual attachment is that you can also set fun little anchors. So this could be 1, 2, so it's always going to be 2 exactly the width of whatever you have or your height. So you can have a lot of great layout control with it, and we can anchor it at the bottom, top, the other side, etc. So lots of options there, and we'll see it used a little bit later in another example, but very fantastic tool to ignore layout space. Now, a very common one, common text widget. Most people know about this widget because it has style rules that can be applied to it. But I want to call out the unsung hero of this widget is allowing for marquee scrolling and ellipses overflow text policy. I'm sure many of us have encountered that localization that breaks your UI or other instances where the text gets really long. So I want to showcase this widget in that lovely use case that we find ourselves all the time. We're going to pop open this editor utility widget, and you can see here we have really long text. And so I've actually got them all set to use the ellipses, and then when you hover over it, it will long scroll this ridiculous lore name that the designer needed to put in, and it messes up your layout. So yeah, let's take a look at these settings and what you can do with this. Now the reason I don't scale the text down is one, accessibility reasons, but spoilers for later, the performance is awful when you do that. And that will be a later topic. So here's our lovely common text block. We've got that here. Here's where you can set the style, but we're actually going to look at the marquee scrolling. And this mouse is very oddly not sensitive. You can see me missing clicking it. This is our scrolling style. These are some default settings, but you can make it faster, slower, fade, a bunch of those settings. And all I have in the graph here is a little bit of a on-hover scroll. Unhover, it stops scrolling. Now if we remove this and we were to set up scrolling enabled, and then down here we've got our little clipping ellipses, but it's no longer going to clip because we're going to scroll. As you can see, when this runs, it's a little distracting. This is a little web, the GeoCity days where we had all that stuff going on. We probably don't want this, and that's why I like to put marquee under some sort of intent for the user to interact. So on mobile, right, we don't necessarily have hover, but maybe that's a press and hold or some other kind of behavior that I know the user intends to look at this, and that's where I put in marquee scrolling. So that's generally what I recommend, so we don't have GeoCities reliving in our games. But maybe that's your style. That's what you want to go for. Next up is the wrap box. This is a lot of my designer friends say I'm too enamored with the wrap box right now. That's so it's so vogue for me. But it's a great widget that you can dynamically wrap in. It can contain many different widget types inside, allow for slot padding included. However, it's not nativized, so if you do want some performance, I wouldn't recommend looking at that for performance reasons. But let's take a look at why I love this widget, and we'll also see it spoilers a little bit later. But I love wrap boxes. One, here it is. Our lovely thing, we have our slot padding included. So I can always set this to be whatever I want, and it automatically updates. What I also like about it is it has different widget types in here. If you use dynamic entry boxes or list views, you can only have one widget class, which is kind of annoying to work with. So this is a fantastic way to get around that. Also, you can say fill empty space. You can force layout decisions here. I can say not force on the line, force on new line. You can also set a pixel width to widget spans. Really flexible layout, especially useful for mobile if you need things to overflow around the screen, etc. Highly recommend taking a look at wrap boxes. I'm loving them right now. All right, and our last topic is spacers on the widget end. Spacers allow for proportional padding and spacing inside of containers. However, it's a very useful widget when it comes to complicated layout transitions. Now, when you think about a spacer, sometimes a UI artist wants to push the layout around as things animate in or out, and I find spacers are the best way to do that. Because if you use a regular way of animating, it doesn't take up layout space, but spacers force layout space, and you can do some incredible things with it. So let's get into that example here. We have a little bit of spoiler branding. I might have looked at the main web page and filled it out. We've got a cool little material that's doing a mip-map blur in the background, and you can see that play forward and reverse node as I'm hammering here and seeing that reverse interactivity. But what's cool is the spacer is pushing the content down, and then I'm relieving that spacer as I animate up. So I can do some complex animations. Let's take a look at how it works. So we've got our grid panel. This is our fancy material that handles the blur. We've got that stack box in here. We have the spacer, and this is what we're animating as the height of the spacer. And we have this text here. This text actually, because I'm a little obsessive, it does perfectly center when it goes in multi-line, as it would. And then we have actually that common visual attachment showing up again. So this doesn't force the container to be larger. We have it taking up no layout space, which contains our description text. And if we open up our animation here, we can take a look at what we're doing. You can see me using those absolute blend types here. I'm just blending between 25 pixels and 409, and so as it slowly animates up, the spacer's going to take up less space so that the content can kind of fill the rest of the screen. So spacers are good for a lot of things, but I find them also very handy for those ways that you want to animate and push your layouts around. Spacers are the way that I do it. All right, and now we're on to one of my favorite topics, fonts. And if anyone has built an editor and used any sort of 2D editing software, you'll realize that the DPI of Unreal is not the same as Figma. And so anything you import in, your font sizes are not going to line up. Well, guess what? We've now enabled the font DPI setting, which is very useful if you want to match any kind of mockup or layout to, say, Figma or any other 2D editing software. And we're going to take a quick look at the olden days and how it's so much better. So this would be a classic thing. I might take a Figma prototype or mockup, import it as a texture, and here I have my text sizes Roboto Bold 60, 30, and 15. However, if I'm in Engine and I were to set this to Roboto Bold 60, 30, and 15, it's going to be a little too large. So most of us have learned the conversion. It's multiplied by 0.75 for all of these, and I have done this I think for 7 years, where it feels that way, but we're going to just do it for old time's sake, revel in the memory. However, now we have the actual setting. In the project settings, you can look up DPI, and right here, whoa, this mouse is so sensitive. I can hit 72, and look at that. It's exactly 60, 30, 15. If you haven't done this already, please do it on your project now while you have the time and you don't have that confusion of what's happening. All right. On to another amazing one is the modifying the ascend and descend values for font metrics. Sometimes you'll import a font in and it has some crazy metrics where it doesn't line up to how your prototypes are, and then you have to go back into the font file and edit it, and you have to find like some how to edit a font software and grab that software and download it and try to put it in and correct it. But guess what? Now we have an engine override. Forget all that, and you're all good. So let's get into demoing the font one. So this is our fonts, and I like to do this with some special characters and accents. You can kind of see it. You can see that these fonts are basically Roboto Regular and Roboto Bold. We're going to modify Bold. So I'm going to find the fonts, Roboto Bold. We have the layout method. You could do bounding box or metrics. Metrics pull from the font file, and then you can kind of overwrite it. So we're going to do something crazy and like we're gonna break the font. Woo! Yes. So yeah, I would recommend shipping that. That's gonna be good. But this is a great way, again, if it's taking up way too much space in your layouts, the ascend and descend values, you can actually overwrite them to your own values instead. But I don't recommend making the descend value larger because you'll run into a problem, so don't be like me. And when I was messing with this, I'm like, ooh, oh no, I broke it. But again, it helps you do it so you don't have to actually modify the fonts. You can actually go in and edit it in Engine to kind of match up a little bit more of what your mockups are, or tighten it a little bit so you have some extra breathing room in some of your layouts. Very useful tool, and I'll say we needed it, and that's why it's in the engine. The second thing that we also put in semi-recently was the apply line height to the bottom line. You can either enable or disable the line height to the bottom part of the text widget, and this allows you to center text perfectly when the line height is greater than 1. Every UI artist is sighing with relief that this exists, but this kind of takes you back to an old arc in time of when we used to use letterpress, and these like classic bars that they would put in the letterpress to make them work. That was the olden days, and that's how old school software was made, and that's when Unreal was made. So we have this lovely double line height down here that makes the text not be centered. So I've got a little demo here. We have this pink box to show you what's perfectly centered, and you can definitely see on the left side, it's not centered. And you're like, why is that? And that's because old school type, you would have double the line height for the bottom. So Unreal is assuming the next line of text is coming right here. Now, harken back to the web era now, we've foregone this technique, and we're like, no, throw this away. Nobody needs the double line height at the bottom. So now we have this lovely setting. Right down here, there's another checkbox you have to find randomly. That will then perfectly center your text when the line height is above 1. And just to kind of showcase, this doesn't apply when you have a standard line height. You could see these line up perfectly. However, when you have the line heights of more than 1, you can see this at play, and now this is perfectly centered, and every artist can sigh with relief that their text is centered. We use that quite a bit after we put it in. And the next one that we're going to talk about on type, last but not least, is monospacing. And this is a great technique for if you're animating numbers or just using numbers in general. Sometimes the numbers don't want to play nice with the width, and monospacing is absolutely critical. So let's get into monospacing. We've got our lovely editor utility widget. And you can see here, I had to change the font because apparently Roboto Bold has monospace type. But with a fancy new script, you can see that gold is popping around because each character has a different width. So we want to apply monospacing to make sure that our layout doesn't break. And so if you go in here, we have this new checkbox, as always. Here, apply monospacing, and you generally want to have a width offset because at 1, this is pretty chunky. It's pretty wide. So the width offset is really handy for getting what you need. So now that when we apply that, we run our editor utility widget, and you can see it's beautiful, no dancing gold around here. Now, this is not the only use case. Let's actually go to our widget switcher. We're going to swap it over to the first, and we're going to run this. And this uses the common numeric block, which can actually linearly interpolate and count up numbers. Very useful block. Hidden slide in here, so 21 things, but don't tell anyone. But you can see it's popping around the gold. So again, very easy. This common numeric block, we just go in here, apply monospacing, and we now will have a very smooth linear interpolation animation. Looks super nice and fancy. So monospacing. Go for it. Go use it. Go wild with your numbers. Next up is the big meaty topic, more tips. We have even more to cover. The very first one is invalidation. You can use global invalidation or invalidation panels to basically cache the paint and layout step of the Slate painting version. I guess we'll see that later in Slate Insights. Now it uses this cache instead of needing to recreate this every single frame. And it will either update itself or when requested or when invalidated. Now global invalidation basically applies to all the widgets inside of the window. Invalidation panels only apply to its children. And the invalidation panel is going to be deactivated if it's a child of like another invalidation panel or when global invalidation is activated. Now this is the best way to get performance out of your UI. So if you're not using invalidation, I would turn it on right now and start getting into it. But let's take a look at how to debug it and how to say what kind of invalidation is doing what. Now we're going to load up our map, and I'm going to minimize that for now. We don't need you. And we're just going to run Pi. This only works in Pi, just as a fun fact. We're going to set our widget reflector. We're going to go and we're going to enable global invalidation. And I'm going to find my Pi window because it disappeared. And I'm going to set some debug things so that we can see what's happening. So Slate debugger, invalidate. We're going to log which widget is invalidated. And we're going to Slate debugger, invalidate. And we're going to enable the invalidation. So now we can see what's going on, and we're going to switch over our output log so we can kind of see which widget is invalidating. So the very first invalidation, which is pretty logical for most folks, is paint. That's when the layout doesn't change, but the visuals change, a new color, opacity, etc. So that's the very first kind of invalidation. The second invalidation is the layout. That's when the size changes, render transforms. You can see at the bottom it's spamming render transform as our layout invalidation. So whenever you do a layout invalidation, it then causes a paint invalidation. And then we have the visibility invalidation, which is pretty common. You set something to hidden, collapsed, set its visibility. A visibility invalidation then causes a layout invalidation, which then causes a paint invalidation. You can see how the waterfall effect is going. And the last one, which is the order invalidation or child order. This is where I'm spawning a different widget on top of everything. That is basically when a child is added or removed, or the index order of how Unreal needs to render which thing in what order. So why do we do this? We basically do this so it's to optimize what level of invalidation happened. So you don't need to basically always call for a child order invalidation when you just need a new paint. So this is kind of why you have all these stages. And again, anytime that you do a child order, it's going to cause visibility, layout, and paint. So which type of invalidation you're triggering is going to actually cost more on performance level of things. So hopefully that's a good breaking point and kind of introduction into it. We're going to disable this. That would not be the one. Let's go to invalidation. Disable it. And we're going to turn on the one last little bit of invalidation with our widget reflector. We're going to turn off global. We're going to turn on the root invalidation so you can actually see an invalidation box as it stands. So this actual widget is inside of an invalidation box. And you can see when I turned on global invalidation, it disabled the invalidation box. You can only have one, general child invalidating at once. And so paint invalidation in invalidation box doesn't have any cache problems. But layout then causes a cache problem, and now it's been cached, and now we're good. So you can also debug the invalidation of invalidation boxes if you're going to go with invalidation boxes instead of global invalidation with this widget reflector. So fun tips, and we'll see a bit more on that topic of performance shortly. However, hopefully that gives you a bit of an understanding of invalidation and how much it'll save on performance. I've seen about 60% on the CPU, so I would highly recommend taking a look. The next thing you can do on performance is obviously having less widgets to need to render. So the better you can get at consolidating your widgets, the more performance you will get out of Unreal. So let's get into one of those demos. This is where I went a little bit crazy. But we have this lovely widget here that is basically 10 widgets deep. I've counted them quite a few times, 10 widgets deep. We have a standard background, our icon. We have an overlay that has our text backing, that then has our text, and a horizontal box that has each one of these little rating or ranking hexagons. So 10 widgets, that's still quite a bit to draw if you have a massive inventory trying to show 100 or something like that. How do we consolidate that? The very first level here is maybe let's put a border and let's consolidate all of our stuff into a material like I do, where we have our texture that then has our icon, we have our background, and we have our backing. Our text backing is combined into one. We've got a little grid panel that's containing a spacer, a set of fixed size, and we have this image that consolidates maybe our ranking here. And again, this is all using the Material Lab, but you could have it be like 5, 3, etc. into that. And you can imagine where I'm going next. Let's see if we can even consolidate it further to just 3 widgets. We now have an overlay. Everything is in this master material now. That includes the ranking, horizontal, those hexagons in there, and all we have is text. So a great way to consolidate. Now, it's not the most flexible. I recommend doing it at the end of your project because this doesn't make it very flexible to work in and iterate at the time, but some great performance can be had by just having it render less widgets. The next example I just want to showcase here is the use of the wrap box. So this is a common example where you have a horizontal box that then has a vertical box, that then has another horizontal box, that then has an icon, that then has a text, that then is calling the vertical box, and all of that. What I love to do is set up those wrap boxes. I'm so in love with wrap boxes right now. All I need is a horizontal box and getting rid of that horizontal to vertical to horizontal again is I just have a wrap box. And instead of I'm having these, the divider is saying fill the empty space, force on the new line, and now I've got my actual text on the new line. So I've reduced one widget, maybe not a lot, but the complexity of needing a lot of horizontal wrap boxes or stack boxes are all gone away with a nice little wrap box. So you can see why I'm a fan right now. Now the next one, and if you take one slide with you, please remember this one. Slate's prepass widgets. Some widgets in UMG take 2 Slate prepasses to go through the widget hierarchy and then paint them. And these are scale boxes, size boxes, rich text, and conditionally text with, if it's set to auto wrap, that's 2 Slate prepasses. If it's set to wrap to pixel size and it's a single line, that's 1. And if it's multi-line, that is 2. Now we're going to do a little bit of profiling here to show you how expensive these widgets can get. So we're going to load up a new map here. I'm going to just showcase some of the settings. I have a plain standalone. I have it set to trace with some memory, because why not, and regular default. Remember to set your trace channel to trace Slate. We're going to open the session browser, which is on the other screen, and we're going to play in the standalone game, and I'll showcase what these widgets are a bit later. But now we have a session loading up, and of course it's loading up off the screen. So we're going to have to move it over. But you can see our trace has started, and very slowly when I can move it over, there we go. This is a very simple text widget, and you'll see why it's so expensive when we get into it. But I'm going to first close that over. This automatically makes our trace. We can open it up. We can see what our performance is like. This is going to first show the memory, because why wouldn't you always want to show memory at the same time? I mean, I love looking at memory. But here's our lovely trace here. I'm going to grab in from kind of this section. Slate, prepass. We're going to highlight the event, and let's scroll into it. This is taking up 577 microseconds. Let's go into some other areas. This is around 442. This is around 445. All right, so let's actually take up what did our widget is basically taking up half a millisecond. And I'm sure you've all done this before or seen this before. We have text inside of a scale box, inside of a size box, so that it always scales no matter what. I'm sure all the localization bugs you fixed have been thinking around this. Yes, this is the biggest sin you can make. So what we're going to do is we're going to replace this with an overlay so we keep the same number of widgets, and you will see how much less expensive. No, get out of here. Get out, get out. You will see how expensive this will suddenly get when you have lots of those widgets going on. So let's make sure we have our session browser open. All right, I'm gonna run. Everything wants to alt tab out. I'm sorry. It's hard to get on the two screens. All right, now we're loading. We're just waiting for the UI to pop in. There we go. Give it another minute or two. Close this out. And again, I'm profiling on the dev. I know, profile on device. Yes, yes, yes. Everyone's gonna come at me, but I just want you to see the principle of it, of what you can save just by removing those widgets out of your pipeline, or as minimal as you can. So we're going to go into Slate prepass, highlight it again. We're going to go in. Yeah, I have to zoom in real hard. Look, I'm at 24. It was at 500. We are now at 24. So watch out for those widgets. Those widgets will get you in performance. Now imagine stacking like 7 of those in a widget. And I've seen that happen. Don't do it. Don't do it, people. Save yourself. So yes, if you take one thing away, please use these sparingly. I mean, not text boxes. You can't really avoid that. But the rest you need to use sparingly just because of these double Slate prepasses. Now, next up, new thing is pixel snapping. Oftentimes in text, the pixel snapping makes it a little choppy, like you're scrolling credits and all of that. So this can help with some of those things. Now, let's get into that demo. Gonna run the editor utility widget. We're popping this open, and so we have scrolling text, and this is with snapping off. On, off, on, off. Now hopefully it's clear in the visualization. I see it very clearly on my screen. I'm not sure if you folks do as well, but it really helps, especially with text. I've seen it really happen, especially with the horizontal scrolling and vertical scrolling going on. Now this is pretty easy to set up. You can go in here. If we go into the graph, we'll just take a look at the logic. I'm just saying unhovered, disable pixel snapping on the entire overlay, and then on unhovered, just snap back to pixel. And that's this overlay right here, so you can even do it on the root of your UI, and that's over here down in the rendering options. You have your snap to pixel settings down there. So quite useful. Next up, and another meaty topic, anti-aliasing. UMG is rendered after post-processing, which means there's no anti-aliasing, and I'm sure we've all seen some pretty bad aliasing, so here are a few techniques to kind of counter some anti-aliasing. It can include bitmaps, AA or anti-aliasing in materials, and my kind of favorite hack is the one pixel transparent border. You'd be surprised, it does some good in there. So let's take a look at our examples that we've got. Now we're gonna do regular pi. Oh, this looks awful. Yeah, good. You guys can see it as well. Yeah, so we've got some really bad jaggies going on. And let's take a look at how do we fix this? How do we make it a little bit better? I'm going to open up the widget here. And the very first one, that is the easiest to make. And again, I'm using the UI Material Lab. We have an SDF circle. And you can just plug in your own anti-aliasing into kind of any gradients in the material. And so it's going to make it a little bit thicker line, but we can see immediately, oh, just the relief of, yes, it's beautiful. Now, I've seen this happen a lot where people want to shear things. They want to shear it to some percent, and it looks pretty rough when it comes down to it. So this oftentimes they'll have a texture or a material and they're shearing it. My recommendation is that lovely little 1 pixel transparent border makes all the difference, at least at the actual resolution. I think it like makes it down to, this is a 256 to a 128, but everything starts dying when you get down to 8 by 8 pixels. Like, it's just, you're just gonna live in that life if you're trying to render something that big there. And then we have our lovely, maybe your game style is anime art or fine art detail. Whew, you're gonna hit some problems here. This is where I think sizing the texture a little bit smaller than you intend it to be actually gets much better results. So this is a 512 being squished into a 256, 128, 64, 32, 16, 8, right? So, or 4? No, I forget. Who knows math? But this is going down, and it's going to look kind of okay here, but it's really failing at these aspects over here. Now this is a 128. No, 128 stretched up to 256. Not really the best visual. However, it's way more graceful at handling going down. And this is where something you might want to consider setting, the DPI of your project to say 2K and gracefully scale a little bit down. I think that's going to handle a little bit better. Or you can go rogue and change this to that lovely world and put on some bitmaps and see how amazing that looks. Now, sometimes you don't want to load the lowest MIP, when you're loading your UI, and it's a pixel blur. That's a bit concerning for the user. So oftentimes I recommend making your own texture group and setting the minimum texture size if you are going to do a bitmap solution. And also remember, bitmaps will indeed increase your texture size by 33%. So that's just something to take into account as well. But the closest you can render and have the texture be the actual size of your intended final resolution, generally the better off you're going to be. And one last little topic on extra tips, editor utility widgets. If you haven't seen already, they're great for standing up a UI quickly without data, playing animations. They just don't have DPI scaling. I've used them literally throughout this entire presentation. You can see some examples here. You can run them by just hitting run. You can open them up and run them. I love them. I test everything this way. I don't need to run Pi. I don't need to load anything in the game. This is my quick iteration pipeline. I love editor utility widgets. Highly recommend taking a look. And then, so that's it for that. Let's talk about the exciting new feature in 5.4, which is the experimental Slate post buffer. This is a way to grab the game scene and display it in UMG. By default, it grabs the game scene. However, it can actually grab some of the UI. So you can see kind of the UI here and the VHS being grabbed. It's definitely way more performant than the natural blur inside of UMG. And you can apply post-processing material effects to anything in UMG and the 3D scene itself. So we've got our lovely content samples. If you haven't taken a look, highly recommend taking a look at this. It's got some great samples. It's the UI Slate post buffer map. We're just going to pop it open and give it a good on look. The very first effect, pretty simple, inverting the UVs, pretty funky. This one, blur. Now why is this special? It's because you can tint your blur. Oh, amazing. You can mask your blur, even more amazing. I'm sure every artist wants to make a star blur shape. Absolutely fantastic. This one, if you want to have your blur along with a center mask, along with low HP, any kind of visual indicator that way. I don't know if you want a Mario underwater UI displacement, a little excessive, but we're not even getting to the most excessive, but usually the most common. Doing some sort of fisheye distortion lens. This is obviously UMG text in here that's being distorted, and then you can even say, hey, but this part of the UMG don't get distorted. And that kind of gives you the spoilers of layers. You can layer these effects together. You can open the submenu, and it's getting the blur, and this one is no longer. So you can kind of layer these post-processing effects together. You can get 6 in the project. There's some amazing documentation on the post-processing. So I highly recommend taking a look. And while it is experimental, Fortnite's already using it, so it's already out to millions of players. So I'd highly recommend taking a look anyway. While experimental, I can say it's already in the game. And with that, thank you, everyone. This was a lot of content. And here's a bunch of QR codes. Anything that I had documentation on, I wanted to make sure you folks could grab it. And yeah, that was 20 things in around 45 minutes, I think. I think I made it around that time. So yeah, thank you.